The night before my medical school interview, my sister poured half a bottle of bleach directly onto my only professional blazer. My parents stood there with their arms crossed and told me to stop making a scene over a cheap piece of clothing. I wore the ruined jacket anyway. The dean of admissions stared at the massive bleach stain, his eyes tracing the raw, exposed inner lining. He looked down at my last name on the application file, and the blood completely drained from his face. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Wait," he whispered. "Are you her?" "My name is Imani Caldwell. I am 28 years old. My family has spent my entire adult life calling me a worthless freeloader. But what they did not know was that the bleach on my jacket had just unlocked a multi-million-dollar secret they had kept buried for 2 decades. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to destroy your future. Growing up in Atlanta as a Caldwell meant you had to project an image of absolute perfection. My parents, Marcus and Valerie, built their entire identity around a highly curated facade of Black excellence and social status. They attended every charity gala and exclusive country club dinner, always making sure my older sister Chloe was front and center. Chloe was the golden child. She was 30 years old, obsessed with curating her social media presence, and married to a wealthy white man named Bradley who owned a medical supply company. Bradley loved to play the white savior, constantly reminding us how his money elevated our family standing. I was the exact opposite. I spent my time studying, working double shifts as a medical scribe, and quietly preparing for the medical college admission test. In my parents' eyes, my refusal to marry rich or work a flashy corporate job made me a massive embarrassment. It happened at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. I had carefully steamed my navy blue blazer and hung it on the door of my bedroom. It was the only expensive piece of clothing I owned, a vintage jacket I found at an estate sale years ago. I was in the kitchen reviewing my interview notes when I heard the unmistakable sound of liquid splashing upstairs, followed by a harsh, burning chemical smell. I sprinted up the stairs and froze in the doorway of my room. Chloe stood there holding an empty bottle of industrial bleach. The caustic liquid was dripping off the sleeves of my blazer, eating through the dark fabric and leaving a jagged, violent orange stain across the entire right side. "Oops," Chloe said, tossing the empty bottle onto my bed. "I guess I tripped." She smiled, a cold, calculated look that told me exactly what this was. She had found my interview invitation letter on the kitchen counter earlier that day. The idea of me getting into a prestigious medical program threatened her position as the only successful daughter. I felt my chest tighten as I grabbed the jacket, rushing it to the bathroom sink to rinse it, but the damage was irreversible. The chemical had burned entirely through the outer layer of wool, exposing the golden silk lining underneath. My parents walked into the hallway, drawn by the commotion. I held up the ruined blazer, my hands shaking with anger. "Look what she did," I told them, my voice cracking. "My interview is tomorrow morning. This was my only professional suit." My father, Marcus, rolled his eyes and checked his gold watch. "Imani, please stop making a scene. It is just a cheap piece of clothing. Your sister said it was an accident." "An accident." I pointed to the bleach bottle sitting on my mattress. She poured it directly onto the hanger. My mother, Valerie, stepped forward, aggressively adjusting her designer necklace. "Well, maybe this is a sign from God. You have no business applying to medical school anyway. You are 28 years old and still living in our guest room eating our food. Medical school is for people with real ambition, not freeloaders. Just throw the ugly thing away and cancel the interview. You are embarrassing the Caldwell name with this pipe dream." Chloe crossed her arms, looking me up and down with pure disgust. "Bradley says you would not even survive the first semester. You should just accept a receptionist job at his company and stop trying to be something you are not. Let the real adults handle the success in this family." They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to cancel my interview, to apologize for causing trouble, and to shrink back into the shadows where they wanted me. But looking at their smug, judgmental faces, a quiet, dangerous calm settled over me. I did not scream. I did not cry. I carefully wrung out the wet fabric, hung the jacket over the shower rod to dry, and looked my mother dead in the eye. I am going to that interview, I said, even if I have to walk in wearing a garbage bag. The next morning, the air in the medical school waiting room was thick with intense competition. Other applicants sat rigidly in their pristine custom-tailored suits. I sat perfectly straight in my ruined navy blazer. The bleach stain stretched from my right shoulder down to the pocket, a glaring burned orange mark that drew horrified stares and cruel whispers from everyone in the room. I held my head high, refusing to let them see my insecurity. I was not there to walk a runway. I was there because I had scored in the top 1% on my medical boards, and I knew I deserved a seat at that institution. When my name was called, I walked confidently into the grand office of the Dean of Admissions, Dr. Sterling. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, known for his rigorous standards and sharp intuition. He looked up from his heavy mahogany desk and extended a hand. As I reached out to shake it, his gaze caught the massive bleach stain on my jacket. He stopped mid-motion. I maintained direct eye contact. I apologize for my attire, Dr. Sterling. I had an unforeseen chemical accident at home last night, but this interview was too important to miss. I chose to show up rather than make excuses. Dr. Sterling slowly lowered his hand and gestured for me to sit. He did not ask about my grades or my personal statement. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes completely locked on the damaged section of my blazer. The bleach had eaten away the top layer of the wool, completely exposing the golden silk lining underneath. Sewn right into the center of that lining was an intricate vintage crest, a medical caduceus wrapped in ivy leaves with a very specific set of ornate initials. "Where did you get that jacket?" he asked, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion I could not quite identify. "I found it at an estate sale years ago," I explained, deeply confused by the question. It was missing some buttons, but the silk lining was beautiful. Dr. Sterling quickly opened my application file, staring at the name printed at the very top. Imani Caldwell. He looked back at the crest exposed by the bleach. The blood completely drained from his face. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked around his desk and crouched down slightly to get a closer look at the embroidered crest on my ruined sleeve. "Wait," he whispered, looking directly into my eyes with utter disbelief. "Are you her? Are you Beatrice Caldwell's granddaughter?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yes," I answered slowly. "Beatrice Caldwell was my maternal grandmother. She passed away 20 years ago when I was just a child." Dr. Sterling backed away, running a trembling hand over his face. He walked over to his massive bookshelf, pulled down a heavy leather-bound medical journal, and opened it. He placed it on the desk right in front of me. There on the glossy page was a photograph of my grandmother in the 1980s. She was wearing the exact same navy blue blazer, complete with the golden silk lining and the custom crest. "Your grandmother was not just a doctor," Dr. Sterling said, his voice trembling with deep reverence. "She was a pioneer. She developed a series of surgical patents that completely revolutionized cardiovascular care for minorities in this country. I was one of her first residents. She was my mentor." I sat there, absolutely stunned. My mother had always told me my grandmother was just a low-level clinic worker who died with nothing. She always dismissed her memory, angrily changing the subject whenever I asked about her. Dr. Sterling sat heavily back in his chair. He looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep concern. "Imani, before your grandmother died, she established a massive medical patent trust right here at this hospital network. She stipulated that the principal sum and all its generating royalties were to be held entirely for you." For me, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why only me?" "Because you were the only grandchild who ever showed an interest in healing," he replied. "She wrote it into the charter. The trust has collected royalties for years. Your medical school application activates your direct beneficiary control. You are the sole heir to her legacy." The room spun. I had spent my entire adult life struggling to pay for textbooks, working exhausting night shifts, and listening to my parents call me a freeloader. I had endured Chloe parading her designer bags and my brother-in-law Bradley mocking my poverty. And all this time I was the heir to a medical empire. But the shock on Dr. Sterling's face was quickly replaced by something much darker. He turned to his computer monitor and began typing rapidly, pulling up the hospital network's secure financial portal. He turned the screen toward me, and what I saw made my blood run completely cold. Imani, there is a serious problem, Dr. Sterling said, pointing to a highlighted ledger on the screen. The trust is active, but the funds are being violently drained. For the last 5 years, exactly $200,000 has been transferred out of your grandmother's trust every single month. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Transferred where I demanded. Dr. Sterling highlighted the destination account. It is being paid out as a consulting fee to a vendor in our system, a medical supply company. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with grim realization. The company is owned by a man named Bradley Kensington. Bradley, my brother-in-law, the man who constantly belittled me for living in my parents' guest room. The man who supposedly paid all the bills and rescued our family. The man my parents worshipped. They were not supporting me. They were stealing from me. My parents, Chloe and Bradley, had treated my grandmother's legacy like a private reservoir while I worked nights and counted every dollar. Chloe had poured bleach on my blazer out of jealousy, trying to humiliate me before the interview, not because she understood what the damaged lining would reveal. That was the brutal irony. Her petty sabotage exposed the crest, led Dr. Sterling to my name, and opened the financial records they had spent years keeping outside my reach. She had tried to make me look smaller and accidentally burned a window straight through their lie. I took a deep breath, the initial shock giving way to a cold, razor-sharp focus. I looked at Dr. Sterling. "Can you freeze those transfers immediately?" He nodded firmly. "I am freezing every trust disbursement and triggering the network's emergency fraud protocol. No one touches another dime." "Thank you," I said, standing up and smoothing down the bleached fabric of my blazer. "Do not alert them. Let my brother-in-law try to run his company today. Let my parents enjoy their stolen money for a few more hours. Because tonight I am going home for dinner, and I am going to watch their entire world burn." The drive back to my parents' sprawling estate in Buckhead felt like crossing into enemy territory. When I pulled up to the wrought iron gates, the driveway was already lined with luxury cars. Inside the house was a sensory overload of catered champagne, smooth jazz, and the suffocating scent of my mother Valerie's expensive perfume. They were throwing a massive celebration. My white brother-in-law, Bradley, had just secured what they thought was a lucrative supply contract for his medical company, and my parents were treating him like the absolute savior of the Caldwell family. I walked through the grand foyer, still wearing the bleached navy blazer. The moment I stepped into the formal dining room, the laughter died down. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. Chloe was leaning against the marble kitchen island, holding a flute of imported champagne and dripping in designer jewelry that I now realized was paid for with my stolen inheritance. She took one look at my ruined jacket and let out a sharp theatrical laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Chloe sneered, pointing her manicured finger at me. "I cannot believe you actually wore that trash out in public. Did security at the medical school even let you pass the front lobby?" My father Marcus stood next to Bradley, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He shook his head in absolute disgust, his face hardening with that familiar look of profound disappointment. "Imani, you are a complete embarrassment. We have esteemed guests here tonight. Business partners, community leaders, people who matter. I told you to throw that hideous thing away. You are making a mockery of our family name, looking like a homeless person who wandered in off the street." Bradley placed a condescending hand on my father's shoulder, playing his favorite role as the benevolent white savior. "Now, Marcus, go easy on her. We cannot all be cut out for the corporate world. Imani is just trying to find her way." He turned to me with a pitying smile that made my skin crawl. "How was the interview anyway? Did you manage to answer any of the basic biology questions? Or did you just freeze up and cry like usual?" I looked at Bradley, taking in his custom-tailored suit and his arrogant posture. I thought about the ledger Dr. Sterling had shown me just hours ago. $200,000 a month. That was how much this man was secretly siphoning from my grandmother's legacy to fund his hollow empire. I was using my birthright to build his wealth, and then looking down on me as if I was dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. I kept my face perfectly neutral, refusing to give them the reaction they craved. The interview was incredibly enlightening, I said evenly. I learned things about my future and this family that I never could have anticipated. Valerie scoffed, waving a hand dismissively as she walked over to the mahogany dining table. Oh, please, stop with the delusions of grandeur. You are 28 years old, unemployed, and living in our guest room. But luckily for you, your brother-in-law actually cares about this family. Bradley has generously offered to help you sort out your pathetic life. She picked up a thick manila folder from the table and shoved it directly into my chest. I caught it just before it hit the floor. What is this? I asked, staring at the blank cover. It is a standard medical and financial proxy form, Valerie said, her voice taking on that sweet maternal tone she only ever used when wealthy guests were within earshot. Bradley is putting you on his company health insurance plan as a dependent. He is also going to help manage your student loan debt, since you clearly lack the financial literacy to do it yourself. All you have to do is sign at the bottom of the last page, and he will take care of everything. We are doing this because we love you, Imani. We want to protect you from yourself. Chloe chimed in, rolling her eyes as she took another sip of champagne. Just sign it and be grateful. Bradley is spending his own hard-earned money to keep you off the streets. You owe him your life. I looked down at the manila folder. My parents were literally standing there, dripping in wealth stolen from my grandmother, demanding that I surrender my autonomy to the very man orchestrating the theft. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were trying to rush me, banking on the fact that I was usually too beaten down by their constant emotional abuse to read the fine print. They thought I was just the scapegoat, the quiet, obedient daughter who would do anything to keep the peace. But I was not the broken, compliant daughter they thought I was. I was a top-tier medical applicant who read complex clinical data for fun. I opened the folder. The first page was intentionally misleading, filled with standard insurance jargon designed to make the reader skip to the end. But as I flipped to the second page, my medical and legal knowledge instantly flagged the specific terminology they had buried in the text. This was not an insurance form. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, locking onto key phrases that jumped off the page: delegation of medical rights, incapacity to manage personal and financial affairs, voluntary surrender of psychiatric autonomy. My blood ran completely cold. This was not ordinary insurance paperwork. Buried inside the medical power of attorney packet was an incapacity declaration designed to brand me mentally unfit and transfer control of my medical and financial decisions to Bradley. If I signed it, I would be helping them strip away my inheritance rights. I realized their plan with terrifying clarity. They knew about the trust. The money had existed for years, but my medical school application activated my direct beneficiary authority. That was what terrified them. If I took control, their monthly withdrawals would end, and the records would surface. They needed my signature before I could exercise those rights. With an incapacity declaration and medical power of attorney, Bradley could rush to the hospital board and court, claiming I could not manage my affairs, then demand control over the trust while they fought the audit. If I resisted, they had another weapon ready: a psychiatric commitment designed to make every accusation I raised sound like an unstable woman. I slowly closed the folder and looked up. The room was watching me closely. Marcus was tapping his foot impatiently. Valerie had a gold-plated pen already held out toward me. Bradley was smirking, waiting for me to seal my own doom. "Is there a problem?" Bradley asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. "It is just a standard signature, Imani. We are just trying to get you the psychiatric help you so desperately need. You have been acting very erratic lately. We are all deeply worried about your mental health." I looked at the pen in my mother's hand, then at the smug, punchable face of my brother-in-law. I tossed the folder onto the dining table. The heavy thud echoed through the suddenly silent room. "I am not signing that," I said, my voice cutting through the jazz music playing in the background. My mother's face contorted with instant rage. The sweet facade vanished entirely. "Excuse me. You will sign it right now, you ungrateful little brat. We are giving you a lifeline. You have no right to refuse us." I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and Bradley. I looked him dead in the eye, dropping my voice to a lethal quiet register. "I am not signing a conservatorship agreement, Bradley. And I am certainly not giving you financial proxy over my life, especially not today. Bradley's smirk faltered. His eyes darted nervously to my father, a brief flash of panic breaking through his confident exterior. What are you talking about? It is an insurance form. Stop being so dramatic. I tilted my head, letting a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Are you sure about that? Because if you were actually managing your finances properly today, you would be a lot more worried about your own accounts than mine. Tell me, Bradley, did you happen to use your company credit card to pay for this lavish catering spread tonight? He stiffened, crossing his arms defensively. What does that have to do with anything? I pay for everything around here. I provide for this family. I took a slow step back, letting the tension stretch until it was practically suffocating everyone in the room. You might want to check your banking app, I said softly. The hospital network's audit triggered a fraud alert on your vendor activity. Your bank's compliance team restricted the corporate accounts tied to those transfers. The room went completely still. The smooth jazz playing from the ceiling speakers suddenly felt deafening. Bradley let out a harsh, forced laugh, adjusting his expensive silk tie. You are bluffing, he scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant bass. You are a 28-year-old dropout. You do not have the power to freeze corporate accounts. I just stood there holding my ground. Check your phone, Bradley. I highly recommend opening your banking app right now. He ripped his phone out of his pocket. His thumbs flew across the screen. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. The smug, superior color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His hands began to shake. He tapped the screen again and again, hitting refresh, but the red error message was undeniable. What is it? Chloe asked, her voice pitching up in panic. Bradley, what is she talking about? My accounts are locked, he breathed, staring at his phone as if it had betrayed him. All of them. The corporate lines, the checking, the payroll. Everything says restricted access. He looked up at me, and the mask of the benevolent, wealthy white savior completely dissolved. His face twisted into pure, unfiltered rage. What the hell did you do, you crazy bitch? He roared, taking a threatening step toward me. My father Marcus immediately stepped between us, but not to protect me. He turned his anger entirely on me. Imani, fix this right now. I do not care what kind of hacker tricks you pulled or what lies you told the hospital. Call them back and undo it. Bradley is the only reason this family is financially afloat. You are destroying our reputation. I walked casually over to the crystal champagne bucket resting on the mahogany side table. I picked up a clean flute and poured myself a drink. I took a slow sip, letting the expensive bubbles coat my tongue before turning back to face my so-called family. I is not floating anything, Dad, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. Bradley is a parasite. For 5 years, he has been using a dummy medical supply corporation to bill the hospital network for phantom services. But the money he was receiving did not come from the hospital's general fund. It came directly out of the Beatrice Caldwell Medical Trust, my grandmother's trust. My mother Valerie grabbed the back of a dining chair, her knuckles turning white. You do not know what you are talking about. Your grandmother left us nothing. She died penniless. She died a pioneer. I fired back, my voice rising to dominate the room. She owned 6 cardiovascular surgical patents that are currently used in every major hospital in the country. She set up a trust solely in my name, because I was the only one who wanted to practice medicine. And you knew it. You both knew it. You let this arrogant, mediocre man siphon $200,000 a month from a black woman's brilliant legacy just so you could buy country club memberships and pretend you were royalty. Bradley was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom suit. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. I managed those funds. I navigated the legal loopholes. Your parents came to me begging for help when they were drowning in debt 5 years ago. Without my business acumen, you all would be living in some rundown apartment on the south side. I elevated this family. I bought this house. I bought those cars outside. You owe me everything. The sheer audacity of his white savior complex was nauseating. He genuinely believed that stealing our money and handing a fraction of it back to us made him our master. You did not elevate anyone, Bradley, I said, setting my glass down with a sharp clink. You stole from a black medical pioneer to fund your pathetic illusion of superiority. You could not build a legitimate business to save your life, so you leached off my grandmother's brilliance. And the best part is you were so incredibly sloppy about it. Chloe lunged forward, her face contorted with ugly, desperate rage. Shut up. Just shut your mouth, Imani. Bradley saved us. Mom and Dad gave him the authorization to use that money because you were too stupid and too lazy to do anything with it. We deserve that wealth. We are the ones maintaining the Caldwell name. I looked at my sister taking in her designer dress and her diamond tennis bracelet. You sold out your own bloodline for a Birkin bag, Chloe. You let a thief degrade me in my own home, all while spending the money that was meant for my medical education. Marcus slammed his hand onto the dining table, the silverware rattling violently. Enough. Imani, you are going to sign that medical proxy right now. We have doctors ready to testify that you are having a severe psychotic break. If you do not unlock Bradley's accounts and sign over the trust, I will personally have you committed to a psychiatric ward tonight. You are not going to ruin everything we have built. I did not flinch. I did not back down. Instead, I let out a low, cold laugh that made my father stop dead in his tracks. You really think this is just a family dispute, do you not? I asked, pulling a thick, folded document from the inside pocket of my bleached blazer. I tossed it onto the dining table right next to their fraudulent medical proxy. What is that? Valerie asked, her voice trembling. That is a preliminary audit report from the hospital board, I said smoothly. When Dr. Sterling saw the routing numbers on Bradley's shell company, he did not just freeze the accounts. He hit the emergency protocol. Moving stolen trust funds across state lines through a corporate medical account is not just theft. It is wire fraud. It is embezzlement. It is a federal crime. Bradley's eyes went wide with sheer terror. He stumbled backward, bumping into the kitchen island. No, he muttered, shaking his head frantically. No, they cannot do that. The hospital administration signed off on the vendor contracts. They signed off on fraudulent vendor invoices and false beneficiary records you created to make the withdrawals look authorized, I corrected him. Did you really think you could move millions out of a monitored medical trust without leaving a digital trail miles long? The hospital board preserved the records and referred the file to federal investigators. Bradley staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His phone began to vibrate violently in his hand, a relentless buzzing alarm that cut through the dead silence of the dining room. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. It was an automated alert from his primary banking institution. Fraud suspected. All assets restricted. Chloe rushed to his side, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She grabbed his arm, shaking it. Bradley, what is going on? Call the bank. Tell them to fix this right now. Tell them who you are. He yanked his arm away from her, his breathing shallow and rapid. I cannot just call them Chloe. If the feds have the routing numbers, they have everything. The shell accounts, the transfer logs, the offshore holding companies. It is all gone. My mother Valerie let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hand against her chest as if she might faint. She turned to me, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate kind of anger. Imani, do you have any idea what you have done? You have ruined us. You are destroying your own family over some ridiculous clerical error. A clerical error, I repeated, my voice steady and cold. Stealing millions of dollars from a medical trust is not a clerical error, Mom. It is a calculated crime. My father Marcus marched toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure authoritarian rage. He pointed a trembling finger inches from my face. You listen to me right now. You are going to pick up that phone and call Dr. Sterling. You will tell him you made a mistake. You will tell him you are having a mental breakdown and that you imagined the whole thing. Bradley is a good man. He took care of us when we had nothing. He saved this family from bankruptcy. The sheer level of delusion in his voice made my stomach turn. He was standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion, wearing a custom suit, defending the white man who was actively robbing our family blind. He was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect a thief just to maintain his fragile illusion of wealth and status. I reached into my bag and pulled out the physical copy of the audit report. I threw it onto the dining table. It landed right on top of their fraudulent medical proxy form. I did not save us, Dad, I said, staring directly into my father's eyes. I want you to open that report and read it. Read it out loud. Look at page 4. Look at the routing numbers. He used a dummy medical supply corporation to siphon $200,000 a month from my grandmother's trust. And what did he do with that money? Turn to page 7. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward the thick stack of papers. Bradley took a step forward, his voice cracking with panic. Marcus, do not look at that. It is fake. She forged it to frame me. I ignored Bradley, completely keeping my focus on my parents. He took my grandmother's legacy, a legacy built by a brilliant black woman who fought for every ounce of respect she ever earned, and he funneled it directly into his personal checking account. He used my money to pay the mortgage on this exact house. He used my money to buy the cars parked in the driveway. He used my money to buy Chloe those pathetic Chanel bags she loves to flaunt on social media. Chloe let out a high-pitched sob, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest, as if I was going to rip it away from her. You are a liar. Bradley works hard for his money. You are just jealous because no one will ever love an ugly, pathetic dropout like you. I looked at my sister, feeling nothing but absolute pity. You sold out your own flesh and blood for a Birkin bag, Chloe. You let this man degrade me, humiliate me, and treat me like a servant in a house that I technically own. He is not a savior. He is a parasite playing dress-up with my inheritance. Valerie stepped in front of Bradley, physically shielding him from me. She raised her chin, adopting the haughty, defensive posture she used whenever she felt her social standing was threatened. We had a right to that money, Amani. Your grandmother was a bitter, selfish old woman. She left that fortune to you just to spite me. I am her daughter. I deserved that wealth. We gave Bradley the authorization to manage those funds because you were too stupid and unstable to handle them yourself. The confession hung in the air, toxic and heavy. They knew. They had known all along. They had actively conspired with Bradley to drain the trust, rationalizing their theft with their own twisted sense of entitlement. So you admit it, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You knowingly committed federal wire fraud to steal from your own daughter. Marcus slammed his fist against the table. We protected our family. We built a reputation in this city. Do you know how hard it is for people like us to maintain this level of respect? We are pillars of the community. We do not air our dirty laundry. We do not let a 28-year-old failure tear down our empire. You are going to fix this, Imani, or I swear to God you will regret it. You do not have an empire, I fired back, refusing to back down. You have a house of cards built on stolen money. And as of an hour ago, the wind just blew it down. The FBI does not care about your country club reputation. The IRS does not care about your dinner parties. You are going to lose everything. Bradley suddenly lunged across the table, his face purple with rage. He grabbed my ruined blazer, twisting the bleached fabric in his fists. You think you are so smart. You think you have won. You are nothing. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I have lawyers who will tie you up in court for the next 30 years. I will make sure you never see a single dime of that trust. I did not try to pull away. I simply looked down at his shaking hands gripping my jacket, then back up to his terrified eyes. Your company is a shell corporation, Bradley, and your lawyers cannot save you from the federal government. The moment the bank reports those fraudulent transfers to the authorities, your assets will be seized, your cars will be repossessed, and you will be facing a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. He released my jacket and stumbled backward, gasping for air. The reality of his situation was finally crushing him. The arrogant white savior had been completely outplayed by the black woman he had spent years treating like garbage. Valerie grabbed Marcus by the arm, her perfect composure finally cracking into pure hysteria. Marcus, do something. She cannot do this to us. She is crazy. She has always been crazy. Tell her she has to stop this. Marcus looked at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. The panic in the room was palpable, but my father was a man who survived by manipulating the truth. He slowly straightened his jacket and walked toward me, his voice eerily calm. Your mother is right, he said smoothly. You are clearly having a severe manic episode. The stress of your medical school interview must have triggered a psychotic break. You are hallucinating audit reports and federal investigations. He turned to Chloe, who was still crying silently by the kitchen island. Chloe, call the private physician. Tell him we need an emergency psychiatric evaluation for your sister. Tell him she is a danger to herself and others. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to maintain my calm exterior. You cannot be serious. That man is a private physician you play golf with. He has no authority over me. Oh, I think he does. Valerie sneered, a wicked, triumphant light returning to her eyes. We have had a medical file on you since you were 18, Imani. We have documented every time you were sad, every time you were stressed, every time you acted out of line. The private physician has already signed the preliminary paperwork. If you do not march back into that kitchen, call the hospital board, and sign over the rights to that trust right now, we will have you strapped to a gurney and locked in a psychiatric ward before midnight. They were not just threatening me. They had laid a trap years in advance. They had weaponized my perfectly normal human emotions, building a fake medical history to use against me the moment I ever tried to claim my independence. They were fully prepared to strip away my freedom and lock me in a cage just to keep their stolen money. I looked at my family. The people who were supposed to love and protect me were standing together, a united front of greed and malice, ready to destroy my life to save their own skin. Sign the paper, Imani. Bradley spat, finding his courage now that my parents had given him a way out. Sign it or enjoy your new life in a padded cell. I did not reach for anything at all. I simply looked at the four of them and let their threat sit in the room. They had finally said the quiet part out loud. If I would not surrender the trust voluntarily, they were prepared to manufacture a mental health crisis and take my freedom instead. Bradley mistook my silence for hesitation. He stepped closer and offered one final deal. Sign the incapacity papers, reverse the fraud complaint, and let him resume managing the trust, and the family would forget everything. Refuse, and the private physician would be ready. My parents stood behind him without objecting, but they had a problem. Their entire social identity depended on the Heritage Charity Gala that weekend. Marcus and Valerie were co-chairs. Bradley was supposed to appear as the brilliant medical entrepreneur they had spent years praising. If I vanished into psychiatric custody before the event, donors and investors would immediately start asking why. I watched my father realize it. His anger stayed, but calculation replaced it. He told Bradley to stop pushing for the signature tonight, not because he cared about me, but because they still needed me, visible, smiling, and obedient, in front of Atlanta society. They wanted one clean public performance before trying to erase me privately. Marcus pointed at me and laid down the new terms. I would attend the gala, wear something respectable, stand beside the family, say nothing about the trust, and let Bradley reassure everyone that his company was healthy. Afterward, he said we would have a serious conversation about my mental condition and my future. I almost laughed. They had just handed me exactly what I needed: a stage. I softened my expression into the smallest possible nod, enough for them to believe fear had finally worked. Valerie exhaled. Chloe smirked. Bradley looked relieved. Inside, I was counting every second. The trust transfers were stopped. The bank's restrictions were tightening around Bradley. The audit trail had been preserved. Now my family was inviting me into a ballroom filled with hospital donors, community leaders, and the exact witnesses they had spent years trying to impress. I left the dining room without signing a single page. For the next 3 days, the house stayed quiet on the surface while panic rotted underneath it. They believed the gala would force me back into place. I knew it would do the opposite. Bradley's corporate accounts remained completely frozen. The federal investigation was quietly but aggressively building a bulletproof indictment behind closed doors. But in Atlanta, high society perception is absolute reality. My parents had been planning to co-chair the annual Heritage Charity Gala that Saturday. It was the most prestigious event for the Black elite in the city, packed with wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites. Rumors were already swirling around the country club about Bradley's company bouncing checks. My parents were terrified of losing their social standing, which to them was far more valuable than their own daughter. My mother called me on Thursday afternoon. Her voice shook with a forced, sugary sweetness that made my skin crawl. She begged me to attend the gala. When I flatly refused, my father ripped the phone from her hand. The sweet facade vanished instantly. He threatened to launch a massive coordinated smear campaign against me. He promised to call every medical board in the country, leverage every political connection he had, and claim that I was a drug-addicted thief who had stolen from her own family. He demanded I show up to the gala, wear a designer gown, and project a flawless united front to reassure their investors that everything was fine. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They genuinely believed that threatening my medical career would force me back into submission. They did not realize they were just handing me the perfect stage for my next performance. I agreed to go. Saturday night arrived, wrapped in velvet and draped in diamonds. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a sensory overload of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests, clad in custom tuxedos and silk evening gowns. Waiters glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and caviar. I arrived perfectly on time, wearing a stunning emerald green gown that flowed like water around my ankles. My hair was styled flawlessly. I looked nothing like the broken, exhausted girl who used to hide in their guest room. I looked like a Caldwell, but more importantly, I looked like my grandmother. I spotted my family immediately. They were holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by influential hospital board members and wealthy real estate developers. Valerie wore a strained, overly bright smile, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Chloe was wearing a dress she had undoubtedly purchased on credit before the frieze clinging to Bradley's arm. Bradley looked like a man walking to the gallows. He was sweating through his expensive tuxedo shirt, his face pale and drawn. He kept checking his phone, jumping at every vibration, waiting for the inevitable federal hammer to drop. When Marcus saw me approach, his shoulders relaxed slightly. He thought my presence meant I had surrendered. He thought I was there to play my part as the obedient, quiet background character. He gave me a stern look, silently commanding me to smile and mingle. I gave him a polite nod, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. I mingled effortlessly, charming the exact people my parents were so desperate to impress. I was waiting for my moment. Halfway through the evening, the orchestra music faded out. The main event was beginning. Marcus walked up the carpeted steps to the grand stage, adjusting his tie as he stepped up to the crystal podium. The crowd quieted down, offering respectful applause to the co-chair of the gala. Marcus leaned into the microphone, projecting his deep, charismatic voice across the ballroom. He delivered a booming, passionate speech about family legacy and the unstoppable power of Black excellence. He spoke about how the Caldwell name was built on integrity and hard work. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it in the air. Then he made his desperate play. He turned his attention to Bradley, gesturing toward him with a wide, proud sweep of his hand. He specifically praised my white brother-in-law for his outstanding contributions to the medical supply industry. He loudly proclaimed that Bradley's company was expanding, thriving, and setting new standards for healthcare logistics. It was a blatant, pathetic attempt to reassure the wealthy investors in the room that Bradley's business was perfectly stable. I was trying to stop the bleeding of their reputation in front of 500 witnesses. The crowd offered polite, scattered applause. Bradley forced a tight, agonizing smile, nodding to the audience while looking visibly nauseous. As the applause began to die down, I set my glass on a nearby table. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown and walked purposefully toward the side steps of the stage. Valerie saw me moving. Her eyes widened in sheer panic. She lunged forward, trying to grab my arm to pull me back into the crowd, but I deftly sidestepped her, gliding up the stairs before anyone could stop me. A murmur rippled through the ballroom as I walked directly up to the podium. Marcus froze. His charismatic smile morphed into a rigid mask of terror. He tried to block the microphone with his body, leaning in to whisper a vicious threat through clenched teeth. "Get off this stage right now, Imani, or I swear I will end you." I did not flinch. I gave him a radiant, camera-ready smile. I leaned in so only he could hear me. "Hand me the microphone, Dad, or I will tell this entire ballroom about the wire fraud right now." Marcus swallowed hard. His hands shook as he slowly stepped aside, offering me the podium to save face in front of the watching elite. He retreated to the back of the stage, looking like a cornered animal. I grasped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of glittering faces. I saw Dr. Sterling standing near the back doors, a proud, knowing smile on his face. I saw Chloe gripping Bradley's arm so hard her knuckles were white. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive ballroom. My father speaks so beautifully about legacy. And tonight I am profoundly honored to speak about the true legacy of the Caldwell family. The legacy of my grandmother, Dr. Beatrice Caldwell. A murmur of respectful recognition went through the older members of the crowd. My grandmother was a pioneer. I continued, my voice steady and commanding. She fought through barriers of race and gender to revolutionize cardiovascular surgery. She left behind a trust designed to ensure that the next generation of medical professionals could thrive without the financial burdens that hold so many of us back. And tonight we are putting that trust to work in a monumental way. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. I locked eyes with Bradley. He looked absolutely terrified. I am thrilled to announce a historic $2 million donation to the Downtown Hospital's Minority Outreach and Residency Program, I declared. The ballroom erupted into genuine thunderous applause. People were cheering, raising their glasses in the air. Marcus looked physically ill. Valerie had covered her mouth with her hands. They knew exactly where that $2 million had come from. But I held up a hand asking for quiet. The crowd settled down, hanging on my every word. While I am honored to facilitate this donation in my grandmother's name, I cannot take all the credit, I said, keeping my gaze firmly fixed on my brother-in-law. You see, this massive contribution was made possible by someone who has been quietly managing these funds for years. I want to publicly thank my brother-in-law, Bradley Kensington. Bradley's head jerked up. The spotlight swung over to him, illuminating his sweat-drenched face. Bradley has been so incredibly generous. I continued, my voice dripping with sweet, lethal sincerity. In fact, his company made a remarkable mistake this morning. $2 million routed through accounts tied to his medical supply operation was recovered and transferred straight back into the Beatrice Caldwell Trust. So I decided to put that accidental generosity to good use. That recovered money is funding this hospital donation tonight. Please, everyone, give Bradley a standing ovation for helping return what never should have left my grandmother's legacy. The trap snapped shut with a resounding crack. The entire ballroom turned to Bradley, clapping wildly, cheering for his incredible generosity. Investors slapped him on the back. Board members raised their glasses to him. I was completely paralyzed. If he took the microphone and denied the donation, he would look like a monster who was stealing credit from a charity in front of the entire city. But by standing there in silence, smiling weakly, as the crowd cheered for him, he was publicly admitting that the money was gone. He was acknowledging that I had stripped his shell company down to the very studs, and he could never ask for a single dime of it back. I stood at the podium, basking in the applause, watching my family realize that I had just weaponized their own precious social standing to permanently seal their financial grave. The applause was still ringing in my ears when the reality of my situation violently shifted. I stood at the podium, basking in the glow of the chandeliers. But the moment I stepped off the stage, my father's private security detail closed in around me. To the cheering crowd of wealthy investors and socialites, it looked like a respectful, protective escort for the generous donor of the hour. In reality, it was a highly coordinated abduction. Marcus gripped my arm with bruising force. His charismatic smile remained perfectly fixed for the flashing cameras, but his voice was a venomous hiss directly in my ear. "We are going home right now. Do not make a sound, Imani, or I will have these men drag you out by your hair." I did not fight them. Causing a physical brawl in the middle of a high society gala was not my style, and more importantly, it would ruin the careful optics I had just established. I kept my posture perfectly straight, nodding politely to the guests, as my family ushered me out the side doors and shoved me into the back of their waiting luxury SUV. The ride back to the Buckhead estate was suffocating. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, toxic, and loaded with unspoken threats. Bradley sat in the front seat, staring blankly out the window, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution being scheduled. Valerie was practically vibrating with rage next to me, her manicured hands curled into tight, trembling fists. The moment the heavy oak doors of the estate clicked shut behind us, The polite high society masks melted completely away. The monsters underneath were finally unleashed. Bradley exploded. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the entryway table and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces across the marble floor. "You gave away $2 million," he screamed, his face turning a dangerous blotchy red. "You arrogant, psychotic bitch. You just bankrupted my entire company in front of the entire city. I am ruined." I looked at him with absolute disdain. "I did not bankrupt your company, Bradley. I simply returned the money you stole back to its rightful owner. You ruined yourself the second you decided to touch my grandmother's legacy." Valerie lunged forward, snatching my designer clutch from my hands. She dumped the contents onto the floor, frantically kicking aside my lipstick and keys until she found my cell phone. She scooped it up, her eyes blazing with a manic, desperate fury. "You are not calling anyone. You are not speaking to anyone. You have humiliated this family for the absolute last time." Marcus grabbed my arm again, his grip tight enough to leave marks. He dragged me toward the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps echoing through the cavernous house. "You are a disease, Imani. You have always been a disease. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. By trying to destroy the only man who actually brought real wealth into this family." He marched me up the stairs and down the long, dimly lit hallway toward my old guest room. The lighting in the house seemed to shift, the warm, ambient glow replaced by harsh, high-contrast shadows that stretched sharply across the walls. The atmosphere was incredibly oppressive, designed to make me feel small, isolated, and entirely at their mercy. Marcus shoved me hard into the dark bedroom. I stumbled, catching my balance against the edge of the mattress. Before I could turn around, Chloe stepped into the doorway. She blocked the exit, looking down at me with a twisted mixture of fear, jealousy, and sheer cruelty. "You have always been the spare part in this family," Chloe said, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing but dead weight, an ugly, useless burden dragging the Caldwell name through the mud. You thought you could just put on a fancy dress and suddenly become someone important. You thought you could take down my husband." She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing into malicious slits. "But you are completely powerless, Imani. You are cut off from the entire world. Mom and Dad have the medical proxy papers printed and ready on the kitchen island. If you do not sign every single one of those documents by sunrise, if you do not legally reverse that donation and hand over full control of the trust to Bradley, we are making the call." I stood in the center of the room, my expression perfectly blank. "What call, Chloe?" "We are calling the private physician and his private medical team," she sneered. "We will tell them you suffered a violent, terrifying psychotic break. They will be here before breakfast. They will drag you out of this house in a straitjacket, and we will lock you in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable life. Nobody is going to believe a crazy woman raving about stolen trust funds. You either sign the papers or you disappear forever." Chloe stepped back into the hallway. The heavy wooden door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked loudly from the outside, locking me in. I was trapped in total darkness. The only light in the room came from the pale moonlight slicing through the window blinds, casting sharp, rigid lines across the floor and over my emerald green gown. My family genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully isolated me, stripped me of my resources, and terrified me into absolute submission. They thought I was sitting in the dark, crying and waiting to surrender. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream for help. I did not pound my fists against the locked door. I sat down gracefully on the edge of the bed and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they completely underestimated who they were dealing with. I reached down to the waistline of my gown, my fingers tracing the fabric until they found the tiny, invisible seam I had specifically requested the tailor to leave open. I slipped my hand into the hidden pocket and pulled out a sleek black backup phone. It was a secure, untraceable device that Dr. Sterling had handed to me in the hotel suite just hours before the gala. We knew my family would try something desperate. We knew that cornered animals always resort to their most vicious instincts when they realize the trap is closing. I powered on the screen, the bright light illuminating my face in the dark room. I opened the encrypted messaging application. I did not need to type a long explanation. I did not need to call the police. I simply pressed the single glowing red button in the center of the screen, instantly transmitting my live GPS coordinates and an emergency distress signal directly to the federal authorities and the hospital legal team waiting on standby. I placed the phone gently on the nightstand, leaned back against the pillows, and waited for the dawn. Because when the sun came up, my family was not going to be greeting a private doctor. They were going to be greeting the full crushing weight of the federal government. The night dragged on, but I did not sleep a wink. I sat by the window watching the horizon slowly turn a pale, bruised purple. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of my family frantically coordinating their master plan. The clinking of coffee cups, the urgent murmurs of Marcus pacing the hallway, the sharp clicks of Valerie pacing in her heels. They were preparing for the final act of their desperate theatrical performance. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy deadbolt on my bedroom door snapped open. The door swung wide, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Marcus stood in the doorway, flanked by Valerie and Chloe. Behind them stood the same private physician. A private physician with a reputation for writing whatever prescriptions his wealthy country club friends requested. And hovering at the back of the group was Bradley. He had his smartphone raised, the red recording light blinking steadily. I was filming the entire encounter to use as legal evidence of my supposed mental breakdown. Imani, sweetheart, Valerie cooed, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern as she stepped into the room. We are so sorry it had to come to this. But your behavior last night at the gala was a clear cry for help. You are sick, baby. You need professional psychiatric intervention. Bradley stepped forward, keeping the camera pointed directly at my face. Just stay calm, Imani. We have an ambulance pulling up to the house right now. The private physician has signed an involuntary psychiatric hold. You are going to a secure facility where you can get the medication you desperately need. Do not try to fight us, or we will have to sedate you for your own safety. I remained perfectly still, sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked at the private physician, who was refusing to make eye contact with me while clutching a clipboard tightly to his chest. Then I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. 7:15. Right on schedule. I am not fighting anyone. I said, my voice eerily calm. In fact, I highly encourage you to keep recording, Bradley. You are going to want a high-definition video of what happens next. Right on cue. The sound of heavy tires crunching over the gravel driveway echoed through the open window. Marcus let out a heavy sigh of relief, thinking his hired transport had arrived. The ambulance is here, he announced, turning to the private physician. Let us get her downstairs before the neighbors see anything. Chloe grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. Get up, crazy. Your free ride is over. I stood up smoothly, shaking off her grip, and walked out of the bedroom ahead of them. I glided down the grand staircase, my family trailing closely behind me, like wardens escorting a prisoner to death row. When we reached the main foyer, the doorbell rang. It was not a polite chime. It was a hard, authoritative pounding that rattled the expensive frosted glass. Marcus adjusted his tie, putting on his solemn, concerned father face. He unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Right this way, gentlemen. She is right here and ready for transport. But the people standing on our front porch were not paramedics holding a straitjacket. Dr. Sterling stepped over the threshold. He was flanked not by local EMTs, but by two stern-faced investigators, wearing official badges from the State Medical Board. Behind them, the flashing blue and red lights of unmarked federal vehicles illuminated the front lawn, completely boxing in Bradley's luxury sports car. Marcus froze. The fake, sorrowful expression slid right off his face. Sterling, he stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. What are you doing at my house? Where is the transport team? Bradley lowered his phone slightly, his eyes darting frantically from the badges to the flashing lights outside. Valerie let out a short, choked gasp and pressed her back against the wall. Dr. Sterling did not even acknowledge my parents. He walked straight past Marcus and handed a thick, sealed document directly to the private physician who was cowering near the base of the stairs. Sterling faced the private physician, his voice echoing with absolute authority through the foyer. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately by the State Medical Board. You are under investigation for accepting financial bribes to fabricate psychiatric evaluations for this family. Hand over that clipboard, step outside, and speak with the investigators before you make your situation any worse today. The corrupt doctor dropped the clipboard as if it had burned his hands. He did not say a single word to my parents. He bolted out the front door, nearly tripping over his own feet in his desperation to escape. Marcus stared in absolute horror as his hired gun fled the scene. He turned back to Sterling, his voice trembling with panicked rage. "You have no right to barge into my home. My daughter is severely mentally unstable. She needs to be committed. We have legal grounds." Dr. Sterling picked up the dropped clipboard from the floor. He glanced at the fraudulent paperwork, tore it cleanly in half, and tossed the pieces onto the marble floor. "I am afraid you are mistaken," Marcus Sterling said, looking at my father with utter contempt. "Imani is not going to any psychiatric ward. After the threats your family made before the gala, the state medical board arranged an independent psychological assessment under secure supervision. She completed it before returning here. Her results were exemplary. She is fully competent, rational, and in complete control of her decisions. Your purchased doctor cannot override that record." Chloe let out a shriek, pointing at me. "She is a liar. She is stealing our money. You cannot just come in here and protect a thief." I stepped forward, moving right into the center of the foyer. The power dynamic in the room had entirely flipped, and my family was drowning in the realization. "No one is stealing anything, Chloe," I said smoothly. "I am simply taking out the trash." The silence in the grand foyer was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic flashing of blue and red lights bouncing off the frosted glass of the front door. If a lens were panning across the room right now, it would capture a masterpiece of aristocratic panic. I watched the reality of the situation hit each of my family members one by one. The camera of my mind captured Marcus first. His broad shoulders, usually squared with the arrogant pride of a self-proclaimed patriarch, slumped forward as a sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Next was Chloe, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between my calm expression and the stern faces of the state medical investigators. Then there was my mother. Valerie Caldwell was a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of flawless Black excellence. She sat on charitable boards, hosted galas, and judged anyone who did not meet her impossible standards. She was also a master of emotional manipulation. The moment she realized that intimidation and threats had failed, her survival instincts kicked in. The harsh, venomous tyrant who had just threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward vanished entirely. In her place stood a weeping, desperate mother. Tears spilled over Valerie's perfectly contoured cheeks. She pressed her hands to her chest and took a trembling step toward me. "Imani, my sweet girl," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a theatrical devastation that would have won an award on any stage. "You have to understand. You have to see this from our perspective. We were absolutely terrified for you. I did not move. I did not blink. I just let her perform. The pressure you have been under." Valerie cried, reaching a hand out as if to touch my arm, though she wisely stopped short of making physical contact. "Applying to medical school, the late nights, the stress. You have been acting so differently lately. A mother's intuition told me something was terribly wrong. We did not want to hurt you, baby. We called the private physician because we loved you. We thought you were losing your grip on reality, and we just wanted to get you the help you needed before you destroyed your bright future." Marcus immediately caught on to her strategy. He straightened his posture, trying to summon the deep, commanding tone he used at the country club. He turned to Dr. Sterling, offering a solemn, deeply concerned nod. "That is the truth, Sterling. This is a tragic family misunderstanding born out of love. We saw our daughter spiraling. We took aggressive action to protect her health. You are a medical professional. Surely you understand the difficult choices parents have to make when their child is experiencing a mental health crisis. We can handle this internally. There is no need to involve the state board or the authorities." I let out a slow, sharp laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the foyer. The sound made Marcus flinch. "You were not terrified for my mental health, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal register. "You were terrified that your credit cards were going to bounce. You did not call a doctor to protect my future. You called a corrupt physician to declare me incompetent so you could permanently steal a legacy that did not belong to you." Valerie let out a wounded gasp, pressing her hand to her mouth. "How can you say that? We are your blood. We gave you everything. You gave me a guest room and a lifetime of emotional abuse. I fired back, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look me in the eye. You spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassment because I did not care about your designer bags or your country club status. But the second you realized I was the sole heir to a fortune, suddenly I was your sweet girl. You were fully prepared to strap your own daughter to a hospital bed and lock her in a padded cell just so you could keep funding your pathetic, hollow lifestyle. Do not you dare stand there and use the word love to excuse your greed. Chloe stomped her foot against the marble floor, her face twisting into an ugly defensive sneer. She stepped in front of Valerie, raising her chin haughtily. You are a liar, Imani. You are making all of this up to ruin us. Bradley is a legitimate businessman. He built his company from the ground up. He is providing for this family. You are just trying to destroy my marriage because you are jealous that a successful man would never look twice at you. I looked past Chloe. While my mother was crying and my sister was screaming, the successful man in question was actively abandoning ship. Bradley had not seen Dr. Sterling walk through the door. The arrogant, condescending white savior who had spent years mocking my poverty and treating my family like his personal charity project was currently sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. He had his phone in his hand, frantically tapping the screen, likely seeing the permanent lock notifications on every single one of his offshore corporate accounts. He knew the fake psychiatric hold had failed. He knew the state medical board investigators standing in the foyer meant that the hospital had officially escalated the audit. He knew that if he stayed in this room for another 5 minutes, he was going to need a criminal defense attorney. While Chloe continued to shriek at me, defending his honor and his wealth, Bradley began to slowly back away. He did not try to comfort his wife. He did not try to defend his in-laws. His eyes darted nervously toward the arched hallway that led to the expansive gourmet kitchen and the heavy glass doors of the back patio. He was doing the math in his head. If he could slip out the back door, cut across the manicured lawn, and reach his secondary car parked near the pool house, he could grab his go-bag and make a run for the state line before the local police were notified. He took another step back, his rubber-soled shoes silent on the marble. Then another. He slid past the decorative columns, completely detaching himself from the family he had supposedly rescued. "Where do you think you are going, Bradley?" I asked loudly, my voice cutting sharply through Chloe's rant. Chloe stopped yelling and turned around. She looked confused for a second, watching her husband retreating into the shadows of the hallway. "Bradley, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice pitching up with sudden panic. "Tell them they are wrong. Tell them your company is fine." Bradley did not answer her. He did not even look at her. The moment he realized I had drawn attention to him, his slow, stealthy retreat turned into a frantic scramble. He turned on his heel and bolted down the hallway. His heavy footsteps slapped wildly against the hardwood floors as he sprinted toward the kitchen. Bradley Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief as he watched his wealthy son-in-law completely abandon them. "Bradley, get back here." The sound of his dress shoes skidding against the kitchen tiles echoed through the house. He was shoving past the marble island, knocking over a tray of expensive glasses left out from their celebration the night before. I could hear his panicked breathing, the desperate grunt he let out as he reached the heavy glass doors at the back of the house. He threw his weight against the handle, ready to burst out into the morning air and disappear. But the handle did not turn. A loud, violent crash reverberated through the entire first floor of the estate. The heavy glass back doors were shoved open from the outside with such immense force that Bradley was thrown violently backward. He hit the kitchen island and collapsed onto the floor, scrambling backward like a terrified child. The back doors swung wide open. Heavy tactical boots stepped over the threshold, crushing the shattered glass beneath them. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering printed across the back stepped into the kitchen. FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely unreadable expression, stepped over Bradley and looked down at him. He pulled a folded legal document from his tactical vest. Bradley Kensington, the agent, stated, his voice, a booming baritone that carried all the way into the front foyer where we stood. "We have a federal search and seizure warrant for this property, your personal vehicles, and the corporate offices of your medical supply company. You are currently under investigation for multi-million-dollar wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. Put your hands on the floor where I can see them." Bradley did not hesitate. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence evaporated in a single second. He dropped flat onto his stomach, pressing his cheek against the cold tile floor. His hands spread wide as the federal agents swarmed him. The sound of metal handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the kitchen, a sharp metallic click that signaled the absolute end of his reign. I stood in the foyer, watching the scene unfold, with an overwhelming sense of calm. The polished, unbothered facade of the Caldwell family had officially been shattered. Marcus was the first to react. For a man who had spent the last decade preaching about loyalty and family legacy, he abandoned ship faster than a drowning rat. He did not ask the agents why they were arresting his son-in-law. He did not demand to call a lawyer for him. Instead, Marcus raised both of his hands in the air, plastering a look of total manufactured shock across his face. "Officers, please!" Marcus announced, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed innocence. "We had absolutely no idea. We are victims here. This man married into our family and used our pristine reputation to legitimize his fraudulent business. We are completely devastated to learn he has been manipulating us." Valerie was right behind him, clutching her chest and nodding frantically. She let out a dramatic, breathless sob. "He lied to us. He told us he was an honest businessman. We trusted him with our daughter's future. We gave him the authorization to manage our family accounts because we thought he was helping us. Please, you have to believe us. We are highly respected members of this community. We would never involve ourselves in anything illegal." They were throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. It was a masterclass in self-preservation. They thought that by playing the victim, by pretending they were just naive, trusting parents who had been swindled by a cunning white businessman, they could avoid the federal crosshairs. But Bradley was not a man who was willing to go down alone. As two heavily armed agents hauled him to his feet, Bradley's face twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive rage. He looked at Marcus and Valerie, his eyes bulging with betrayal. He thrashed against the agent's grip, spitting his words across the kitchen island. "You lying, pathetic hypocrites!" Bradley screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. "You victims! You came begging to me! Do not you dare stand there and pretend you did not know exactly where that money was coming from!" Marcus stepped back, his face turning an ashen gray. "Shut your mouth, Bradley. Do not make this worse for yourself by spreading baseless lies." But Bradley was completely unhinged. The prospect of a federal prison sentence had stripped away any remaining shred of loyalty. He turned his attention directly to the lead FBI agent, speaking rapidly, desperately trying to trade his family for a plea deal. "Check the property records!" Bradley shouted, his voice echoing into the foyer. "Check the deeds on this house. Marcus Caldwell is completely bankrupt. He secretly took out a second and third mortgage on this multi-million-dollar estate just to pay off his gambling debts and keep up his country club dues. He was drowning. They were about to be foreclosed on 5 years ago." Valerie let out a high-pitched shriek. "Stop talking! You are insane! I was the one who saved them," Bradley continued, laughing a harsh, manic laugh. "Marcus came to me. He handed me the routing numbers to Beatrice Caldwell's medical trust. He begged me to set up the shell corporations. He told me exactly how to bypass the hospital board. I was washing the stolen money through my supply company and funneling it right back into their personal checking accounts so they could pretend they were still rich. They are not victims. They are the masterminds." The federal agents did not look surprised. They simply continued taking notes, their faces completely impassive. They had likely already seen the paper trail, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the ugly, desperate truth tear through the air of that luxurious mansion, was a profound moment of destruction. The sacred, untouchable image of Caldwell excellence was dead. The grand narrative my parents spun about their hard work, their status, their moral superiority, it was all a complete fabrication. They were not pillars of the community. They were common thieves who had sold out their own heritage, their own daughter, and their own family's legacy just to keep up appearances. I watched my father shrink. The commanding patriarch who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just 20 minutes ago was now trembling. his eyes darting frantically around the room as he realized he could not charm his way out of a federal indictment. Valerie leaned against the wall, her face buried in her hands, no longer performing but genuinely terrified. And then there was Chloe. Chloe had been standing near the staircase, completely frozen as she watched her wealthy husband being treated like a common criminal. The realization that her credit cards were useless, that her designer wardrobe was bought with stolen funds, and that her entire lifestyle was about to be seized by the government finally shattered her reality. She lunged forward, pushing past Marcus and Valerie, sprinting toward the kitchen. She grabbed the arm of the lead FBI agent, her face contorted in absolute hysteria. "You cannot take him!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking. "You cannot arrest him. He did not steal anything. We were entitled to that money. It was ours." The agent firmly detached her hand from his uniform. "Ma'am, step back immediately. Your husband is being taken into federal custody." Chloe was completely losing her mind. The impending loss of her social status was driving her to the brink of insanity. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. "She is the one you should be arresting. She is trying to steal it from us. That trust fund was supposed to be mine. My grandmother was just a senile, bitter old woman. She made a mistake leaving it to this useless, unemployed loser. We had every right to take it back." The entire room went dead silent. Even Bradley stopped thrashing against his handcuffs, closing his eyes in absolute defeat. Chloe was so consumed by her own jealousy, so desperate to defend her stolen wealth, that she did not even realize what she had just done. In her frantic attempt to justify their actions, she had just loudly and clearly admitted to the crime in a room full of federal investigators. She had just confessed that they knew the money belonged to me, that they believed my grandmother was wrong to leave it to me, and that they felt entirely justified in taking it by force. The lead FBI agent slowly turned to face Chloe. He pulled a small notebook from his tactical vest and flipped it open. "So just to be absolutely clear," the agent said, his voice deadly calm, "you are openly admitting that you and your husband knowingly intercepted funds from a legal trust that did not belong to you because you disagreed with the beneficiary's designation." Chloe blinked, her mouth hanging open as the gravity of her own words finally caught up to her. She looked at the agent, then at Bradley, who was shaking his head in absolute despair. "No," Chloe stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. No, that is not what I meant. I meant we were holding it for her. We were managing it." The agent raised one hand. "Ma'am, stop talking. Anything else you volunteer will be documented. Step back, say nothing further, and contact an attorney before you make this worse." I stood in the foyer, arms crossed, watching the golden child unravel. She had spent her life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She had poured bleach on my blazer to keep me below her. Now her mouth had handed federal investigators a statement tying her directly to the theft she pretended not to understand. She was not being led away in cuffs, but the protective wall around her had vanished. The agents hauled Bradley up by his elbows. The custom tailoring of his suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, making him look entirely pathetic and small. His designer loafers dragged against the expensive marble floor as they marched him from the kitchen through the grand foyer. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at my parents. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, completely unable to face the blinding red and blue police lights flashing through the front windows. As the heavy wooden door opened to escort him out, the aggressive sound of grinding diesel engines filled the crisp night air. 3 massive flatbed tow trucks were backing their way up the long, winding driveway of the estate. Their bright amber strobe lights swept across the perfectly manicured lawn, cutting violently through the darkness, and illuminating the pristine landscaping my parents had always valued more than their own daughter. Chloe pushed past the federal agent standing in the hallway and sprinted out the front door. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that echoed through the affluent Buckhead neighborhood. A burly tow truck operator in a neon safety vest was already securing thick metal chains around the rear axle of her custom white Porsche. It was the exact car she had purchased using the stolen royalties from my grandmother's medical patents. "You cannot take that!" Chloe shrieked, sprinting across the driveway and slapping her hands against the hood of the sports car. "I just paid for the ceramic coating. That is my car. You have no right to touch it." The tow operator did not even flinch. He simply tightened the winch, pulling the luxury vehicle forcefully up the steel ramp. The screech of the tires against the metal sounded like a final definitive judgment. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the operator said in a bored, monotone voice. "The federal government owns this vehicle now." Marcus and Valerie stumbled out onto the front porch just in time to see the second and third tow trucks position themselves in front of the massive garage. The operators moved with practiced efficiency, hooking up Marcus' prized vintage Mercedes and Valerie's brand new luxury SUV. My father gripped the stone railing of the porch, his chest heaving as he watched his entire identity being hauled away into the night. For a man obsessed with black excellence and social superiority, this was a fate worse than death. The wealthy elite neighbors he had spent decades trying to impress were definitely watching. Across the expansive lawns, curtains were twitching. Porch lights were flicking on. The Caldwell family, the supposed pillars of the community, were being publicly dismantled by federal authorities. Every single status symbol they had acquired through theft and deceit was being stripped away in front of the entire neighborhood. I walked out through the front doors, stepping onto the massive stone portico. I moved to the edge of the top step and looked down at them. The world felt like it was tilting on its axis, spiraling completely out of control for the people crying in the driveway. The flashing lights and the chaotic shadows made their reality look warped and unstable. But as I stood there looking down from the highest point of the entryway, I had never felt more grounded. I was an immovable force, finally taking my rightful place above the people who had tried to bury me. Valerie collapsed onto the bottom step of the porch, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her perfect hair was ruined, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She rocked back and forth, sobbing uncontrollably as the tow trucks shifted into gear and began rolling down the driveway, taking her entire fabricated life with them. Marcus walked over to her, his movements stiff and robotic. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder, trying to summon one last shred of his patriarchal authority. He needed to believe that he still had some measure of control, some foundation left to stand on. "It is going to be all right, Valerie," Marcus said, his voice cracking with desperation. "They can take the cars, they can freeze the accounts, but we still have the estate. The house is in my name. We will hire a defense attorney in the morning. We will fight this from home. We are not out on the street." I looked over my shoulder and gave a slight nod to my attorney from the trust's legal team, who was standing quietly just inside the foyer. He stepped out onto the porch carrying a crisp white document in his hand. He walked slowly down the stairs, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the stone, and stopped right in front of my father. Marcus looked at the lawyer, his eyes wide with a new, distinct kind of terror. "I am afraid you are incorrect, Mr. Caldwell," the litigator said, his voice perfectly polite but utterly devoid of sympathy. He held the single sheet of paper out toward my father. Marcus hesitated before reaching out with a shaking hand. He took the paper and held it up to the porch light. I watched his eyes scan the bold black text at the top of the page. I watched his knees physically buckle, his entire body going slack as the realization hit him like a freight train. "What is it?" Valerie cried, reaching up and grabbing Marcus by the sleeve. "Marcus, what does it say?" Marcus could not speak. His mouth hung open but no sound came out. The last remaining pillar of his ego had just been completely obliterated. I walked slowly down the stairs, stopping one step above them, so I could look directly into my mother's tear-stained face. "It is a 24-hour eviction notice, Mom," I said smoothly. Valerie stared at me, her face contorting with sheer confusion. "That is impossible. We own this house." "You owned a mountain of debt," I corrected her. "You and Dad had stacked 3 mortgages onto this property just to keep up appearances." Once the audit exposed how stolen trust money had been feeding those payments, the trust's recovery team moved on the distressed liens. Tonight's federal freeze triggered the final enforcement step. I leaned forward, making sure she heard every single word clearly over the sound of the departing tow trucks. "And the Beatrice Caldwell Medical Trust bought it." Chloe, who had been weeping on the driveway, stopped crying and stared at me in absolute horror. "I own this estate now," I said, my voice echoing in the cold night air. "I own the walls, I own the roof, and I own the ground you are currently kneeling on. And since you are all active liabilities to my assets, I am terminating your residency." You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap, legally acquired clothes you have left and vacate my property. The eviction notice trembled violently in Marcus's hands. He read the bold black letters over and over again, as if staring at the paper long enough would somehow change the reality of what was written on it. But the ink did not shift. The truth was absolute. For my entire life, Marcus had stood like a towering monument of untouchable pride. He was a man who demanded respect, who equated his worth to the square footage of his estate and the brand of his tailored suits. Now I watched that monument completely crumble. His legs gave out. Marcus Caldwell, the self-proclaimed patriarch of Atlanta high society, dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the cold stone of the front porch. The sharp impact echoed in the night air. He did not care that the neighbors across the street were watching from their windows. He did not care about the pristine image of black excellence he had spent decades violently protecting at my expense. He was utterly broken. Valerie let out a shattered, agonizing wail. Seeing her husband collapse shattered the final fragile piece of her composure. She threw herself onto the ground beside him, her expensive silk evening gown pooling awkwardly around her on the hard stone. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out with desperate trembling fingers to grab the hem of my emerald green dress. Imani, please, Valerie sobbed, her voice hoarse and unrecognizable. Please, baby, you cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you. We put a roof over your head and food on your table. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, pulling the fabric of my dress out of her frantic grip. Do not touch me, I said, my voice quiet but laced with an icy finality. We made a mistake, Marcus pleaded, looking up at me with eyes completely bloodshot and wide with terror. We were drowning in debt, Imani. We were terrified of losing everything. We let greed cloud our judgment, but we are still your family. We are your blood. You cannot kick your own mother and father out onto the street. You cannot leave us with nothing. I looked down at the two people who had made my existence a living nightmare. They were not crying because they regretted betraying me. They were not apologizing for the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, or the calculated theft of my grandmother's legacy. They were crying because they had been caught. They were begging because they were currently staring down the barrel of homelessness and federal prison. You did not make a mistake, Dad, I said, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. A mistake is forgetting to pay a water bill. A mistake is missing an exit on the highway. What you did was a deliberate daily choice. You chose to steal from my trust fund every single month for 5 years. You chose to let a racist, arrogant man degrade your daughter in her own home. You chose to print a fake psychiatric evaluation, to lock me in a padded cell so you could keep funding your country club lifestyle. Valerie pressed her hands together in a desperate posture of prayer. We will pay it back. We will find a way to make it right. Just give us time, Imani. Have mercy on us. Mercy, I repeated, letting the word hang in the crisp night air. I turned slightly and signaled to my attorney standing by the front doors. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a clear plastic garment bag. He stepped forward and handed it to me. I unzipped the bag in one smooth, fluid motion. I reached inside and pulled out the navy blue blazer. The harsh, bright security lights of the porch illuminated the violent orange bleach stain stretching across the shoulder and down the sleeve. The fabric was eaten away, exposing the golden silk lining and the custom medical crest of my grandmother. My parents stared at the ruined jacket. The air was suddenly sucked completely out of the space. They remembered exactly what had happened the night that stain was created. Do you remember what you told me when Chloe poured industrial bleach on my only professional suit the night before? The most important interview of my life. I asked, my voice slicing through their sobs like a scalpel. You stood right there, Mom, with your arms crossed, and you told me to stop making a scene. You told me it was just a cheap piece of clothing. You told me I was a failure who had no business applying to medical school. I let the jacket drop from my hand. It landed with a soft thud on the stone steps, right between my kneeling parents. Well, I said, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my mother. My loyalty to this family has been bleached away just like the fabric of this cheap jacket. There is absolutely nothing left to salvage. You burned it to the ground. Valerie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of my words sank in. Marcus simply stared blankly at the ruined blazer on the ground, his spirit entirely defeated. There were no more arguments to make. There were no more lies they could spin. The Caldwell Empire was officially dead. Suddenly, a chaotic scrambling sound came from the driveway. Chloe pushed herself up from the pavement where she had been watching her Porsche get towed away. Her designer heels were scuffed, her dress torn at the hem. She staggered up the steps and threw herself onto her knees right next to our parents. She did not look at the eviction notice. She did not care that her mother and father were about to be homeless. Her mind was entirely consumed by the loss of her wealthy white savior and the lavish lifestyle he had provided for her. Imani, please, Chloe begged, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. You have to give the money back. You have to tell the FBI it was a misunderstanding. They are going to put Bradley in federal prison. He is my husband. He is all I have. I will do anything you want. I will apologize for the jacket. I will apologize for everything. Just give him back his company. Give us back our money. Save my husband. I looked down at my sister, the golden child, the woman who had spent her entire 30 years treating me like a worthless peasant. She was currently on her hands and knees offering a pathetic empty apology solely to regain access to a stolen bank account. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness. I felt a profound absolute indifference. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults at her. I simply looked at Chloe, letting a slow, cold, utterly detached smile spread across my face. I did not say a single word to her. I turned my back on my kneeling family, walked down the stone steps, stepped over the shattered remnants of their pride, and slid into the back seat of my waiting car. The heavy door of this town car slammed shut, cutting off the frantic, pathetic cries of my mother and sister. As the driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing red and blue lights behind, I did not look back. That heavy final thud of the car door echoed in my mind, perfectly matching the sound of my new life beginning. Fast forward exactly 1 month, and that sound seamlessly transitioned into the soft, mechanized hum of a private elevator opening directly into my brand new penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. I stepped out of the elevator and breathed in the crisp, clean air. There was no overwhelming stench of my mother's expensive, suffocating perfume. There was no booming, arrogant voice of my father demanding absolute obedience. There was no toxic, suffocating energy pressing down on my shoulders. There was only sunlight pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm golden glow across the sleek hardwood floors. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, a vast horizon of endless possibilities. I walked over to the kitchen island, poured myself a cup of fresh coffee, and looked out over the city. I was completely, undeniably free. The aftermath of that night at the Buckhead estate had been swift and absolute. True to my word, I did not let them stay. The very next morning, a private security firm hired by the trust arrived at the property to enforce the eviction notice. My parents and Chloe were forced to pack whatever they could fit into a few basic suitcases and leave the premises on foot. I immediately put the sprawling mansion up for sale. I had zero interest in living in a house that was built on a foundation of lies, stolen money, and emotional abuse. I wanted a space that belonged entirely to me, purchased with clean hands and a clear conscience. This penthouse was exactly that. My professional life completely transformed as well. The week after the arrests, I officially accepted my seat at the medical school. Walking through the grand double doors of the campus on my first day of orientation felt surreal. I was no longer the exhausted, terrified girl wearing a bleached blazer, desperately hoping for a chance to prove myself. I was an incoming medical student, and more importantly, I was the primary benefactor of the institution. Dr. Sterling had personally overseen my transition into the program. He made sure I was treated like any other student in the classroom, which was exactly what I wanted. I did not want special treatment when it came to my education. I wanted to earn my medical degree through grueling study sessions, clinical rotations, and sheer hard work. I thrived in the rigorous academic environment. Every late night spent poring over anatomy textbooks and medical journals felt like a victory. I was finally using my mind for exactly what it was meant for, rather than using it to constantly defend myself against my family's psychological warfare. But outside the classroom, I used my beneficiary authority with absolute precision. I took full control of the Beatrice Caldwell Medical Trust and ordered a complete governance review. With the trust legal team beside me, I removed every administrator and outside vendor representative who had approved Bradley's shell company invoices without proper verification. Anyone whose conduct suggested corruption was referred to investigators. Anyone whose failure was negligence lost access to the trust. I then rebuilt the oversight structure around independent financial experts, strict dual approval rules, and transparent reporting, so no relative contractor or hospital insider could ever treat my grandmother's royalties like a private checking account again. Once the accounts were secured and the stolen funds were legally recovered by the federal government, I set out to do what my grandmother had always intended. I was not going to hoard the wealth like my parents had done. I was not going to use it to buy sports cars or designer handbags to impress superficial socialites. I was going to use it to build a real lasting legacy of Black excellence. I organized a press conference in the main atrium of the hospital, standing in front of a beautiful, newly commissioned bronze bust of Dr. Beatrice Caldwell. With the local news cameras rolling and the hospital staff gathered around, I announced the creation of the Beatrice Caldwell Memorial Scholarship. It was a fully funded comprehensive financial program specifically designed to support brilliant underrepresented minority women entering the medical field. The trust would pay for their full tuition, housing, and living expenses. I wanted to ensure that no talented young Black woman would ever have to work 3 exhausting jobs just to afford her textbooks. I wanted to guarantee that no future doctor would ever have to sleep on a broken couch or endure financial abuse from toxic relatives just to chase her dreams. I was giving them the safety net that I had been denied for so long. Looking out at the crowd that day, seeing the tears of joy in the eyes of the first 3 scholarship recipients, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. My grandmother's brilliance was finally healing people just as she had always wanted. Life settled into a beautiful, productive rhythm. My days were filled with lectures and labs, and my evenings were spent in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. I surrounded myself with genuine friends, classmates who shared my passion for medicine, and mentors who valued my intellect. I was no longer walking on eggshells. I was no longer shrinking myself to make other people feel big. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, about 6 months after the night the FBI raided the estate. I was sitting on my velvet sofa, highlighting a chapter in my neurology textbook. The massive television mounted on the wall was playing the local evening news at a low volume. I was barely paying attention until a familiar name cut through the ambient noise of the broadcast. I looked up, my highlighter pausing on the page. The news anchor was looking directly into the camera, a graphic of a federal courthouse displayed over her right shoulder. Today in federal court, the anchor announced a high-profile medical fraud case reached its conclusion. Bradley Kensington, the former CEO of a prominent local medical supply company, has been officially sentenced. Kensington pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering in connection to a massive scheme that drained millions from a charitable medical trust. The screen flashed to footage of Bradley being escorted out of the courthouse. He was wearing a drab, oversized tan prison jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled in heavy metal cuffs, and a chain wrapped around his waist. He looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, tailored white savior who used to stand in my parents' kitchen and mock my existence. He looked aged, terrified, and utterly broken. The judge showed no leniency. The news anchor continued, her voice crisp and professional, citing the severe breach of medical ethics and the staggering financial damage. The court imposed a 10-year federal sentence on Bradley Kensington. The report said he would be transferred into federal custody immediately to begin serving it. I stared at the television screen as the footage transitioned to a commercial break. 10 years. 10 years in a federal cage where his country club memberships, his supposed business acumen, and his unearned arrogance would not mean absolutely anything. The justice system had finally caught up to his hubris. The parasite had been permanently removed from the host. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I closed my textbook, ready to head into the kitchen to make some tea, when the sudden sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the penthouse. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the device. The caller ID did not show a name. It displayed an unknown number routing through an institutional switchboard. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before swiping my finger across the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear. An automated robotic voice immediately began to speak. "You have a prepaid collect call from an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution in Atlanta." The automated voice paused, allowing the inmate to state their name for the recording. "Imani, please do not hang up. It is me, Bradley." His voice was a pathetic, trembling whisper stripped of all its former power. The man who had once threatened to throw me out on the street was now calling me from a concrete box, begging for my attention. I did not say a single word. I did not need to. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at the glowing red icon on the screen and tapped it. The call disconnected, instantly cutting off his pathetic whimpering. The silence that followed was profound and incredibly satisfying. For years, Bradley had filled my daily life with his booming, condescending voice. He had lectured me about his supposed superiority, mocked my ambitions, and constantly reminded me that I was living on his charity. Now, a single tap of my finger had erased him from my existence entirely. I blocked the institutional number, tossed my phone onto the plush velvet sofa, and walked into my immaculate kitchen to brew a cup of chamomile tea. He was officially a ghost. Word travels fast in Atlanta. In the affluent, highly connected circles of Black high society, gossip is a currency far more valuable than gold or real estate. I did not have to hire a private investigator to find out what happened to my parents and my sister. I did not even have to ask. The news of their catastrophic downfall was delivered to me on a silver platter just a few days later. A few days later, the fallout reached me exactly the way their world always worked, through church group messages, clipped local news segments, public filings, and screenshots people passed around like currency. I did not ask anyone to investigate them, and I never sent anyone to follow them. I did not need to. Marcus, Valerie, and Chloe had become the story Atlanta society could not stop discussing. The updates about my parents were brutally consistent. Marcus and Valerie had lost the estate, lost access to the accounts that sustained their image, and become the subject of whispers throughout the same community they once tried to dominate. Screenshots, voice notes, and news clips painted the rest of the picture without requiring me to call any relative. After I had legally evicted them from the estate, Marcus and Valerie had nowhere to go. Their credit scores were entirely obliterated by the defaulted mortgages and the federal asset freeze. They could not even qualify for a standard lease in a decent neighborhood. They were forced to rent a cramped, poorly ventilated two-bedroom apartment in a decaying building complex on the far outskirts of the city. The roof leaked, the appliances were ancient, and the walls were paper-thin. But the physical downgrade was nothing compared to the social execution they were facing. Marcus and Valerie had built their entire identity around being the most respected, untouchable couple at their church. They used to demand front-row seating, donate heavily with stolen money to buy influence, and judge anyone who failed their pristine standards. One message circulating after Sunday service said they actually had the nerve to show their faces at church. They walked through the heavy wooden doors believing they could smile through the scandal. Instead, every conversation around them died the instant they entered. The congregation turned its back on them. Ushers politely but firmly directed them to the last row, far from the prominent families they used to court. Whispers moved through the pews before the opening hymn was finished. Then the senior pastor stepped to the pulpit and delivered a blistering sermon on false idols, greed, and the consequences of stealing a sacred legacy. He never said the Caldwell name, but he did not need to. Marcus sat bowed over in a cheap suit, sweating through the collar. Valerie hid beneath a wide-brimmed hat and pressed a tissue to her face, while people who once praised her avoided even looking in her direction. Another update said they rushed out as soon as the service ended. Marcus had been applying for corporate management work, but background checks kept surfacing his connection to the federal fraud investigation. No legitimate firm wanted the risk. Valerie had begun pawning the last pieces of jewelry she could prove were legally hers just to keep the electricity on in their cramped apartment. Every status symbol they once used to measure human worth had become something they had to sell for groceries and utility bills. I stirred my coffee looking out the restaurant window at the bustling city street. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. They were finally living the exact life they had callously threatened to force upon me for years. The universe was simply balancing the scales. Reports on Chloe were even harsher than those about my parents. Her collapse had become its own cautionary story. The golden child who built her entire personality around luxury brunches, country club photographs, designer labels, and humiliating anyone she considered beneath her, had been abandoned by that social circle the moment Bradley's mugshot hit the news. Without his stolen money, her carefully curated identity collapsed faster than the federal case that destroyed it. With her husband in a federal penitentiary, and all of her joint accounts seized by the IRS. Chloe was left completely destitute. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and an employment history that consisted solely of spending other people's money. She had to swallow every single ounce of her towering pride just to survive. Then a grainy phone photo started circulating through those gossip channels. It had been taken inside a discount grocery store the previous afternoon. I looked down at the screen. The image showed the interior of a discount grocery store. Standing behind register number 4, wearing a hideous oversized polyester uniform vest with a plastic name tag pinned to her chest, was my older sister. Chloe's perfectly highlighted hair was tied back in a messy, frizzy bun. Her acrylic nails were gone. The heavy, exhausted bags under her eyes were visible even from a distance. She was scanning canned beans and discounted toilet paper. The caption attached to the photo made the humiliation even sharper. A group of Chloe's former country club friends had entered the store for party supplies and walked directly toward her register. Chloe saw them coming and tried to hide behind the monitor. They recognized her anyway. They laughed, whispered among themselves, and deliberately carried their baskets to another lane. The same people she once used as proof of her superiority now treated her like background noise while she stood there in a polyester uniform scanning groceries for strangers. I closed the image without smiling. The justice was almost cinematic on its own. Chloe, who had spent 30 years making sure I understood that she considered me beneath her, was now wearing a name tag and bagging groceries for minimum wage, shunned by the superficial world she had sold her soul to impress. I set my phone face down and returned to my own life. The money I used was mine. The home around me was mine. My medical education and the careful management of my grandmother's trust were moving forward without a single permission slip from the Caldwells. Their humiliation no longer required my presence to continue. The contrast between their agonizing reality and my absolute peace was profound. I walked into my spacious, sunlit living room, kicking off my heels and sinking into the deep cushions of my sofa. The quiet hum of the city far below was the comforting soundtrack to my new life. I had reclaimed my grandmother's legacy. I was thriving in medical school. I had completely excised the malignant tumor that was my biological family. I had won. I opened my textbook, ready to dive into an afternoon of studying, when my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It was a text message from a number I had not blocked yet. I picked up the phone and looked at the glowing screen. The message was from Chloe. It did not contain her usual arrogant demands. It did not contain insults or threats. It was just 3 short, incredibly desperate sentences. I am sorry. I was wrong. Please help me. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. 3 short sentences from a woman who had spent 30 years making sure I felt entirely invisible. I am sorry. I was wrong. Please help me. A year ago, a message like that from my older sister would have sent me into a desperate tailspin. I would have dropped everything, opened my wallet, and drained my own emotional reserves just to earn a fraction of her approval. I would have believed the apology was real. But I was no longer the frightened girl hiding in the guest room. I looked at the words and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a profound, impenetrable calm. I did not type a reply. I did not ask her to explain herself. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, swiped left, and tapped the red block button. The contact vanished. The thread was deleted. There would be no easy forgiveness. There would be no tearful reconciliation. Some bridges are burned so thoroughly that the only logical choice is to sweep away the ashes and keep walking. I tossed the phone onto the glass coffee table and leaned back against the plush velvet cushions of my sofa. My penthouse was alive with the warm, vibrant sounds of genuine laughter. I was hosting a small dinner party, and the people filling my living room were not social climbers or wealthy parasites. They were classmates and colleagues from medical school, brilliant young black men and women, pushing through brutal exams, labs, and clinical training while changing the face of healthcare. Soft neo-soul music played from the speakers, blending with the clinking of glasses and the rich scent of catered food. Two classmates stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, debating a cardiovascular case from training. Others crowded around the kitchen island, comparing notes after a brutal week of labs. These were the people who had studied beside me until dawn, shared coffee and clinical flashcards, and celebrated my mind rather than my bank account. They knew my worth before the trust became mine to control. Watching them joke around my kitchen island, my mind briefly flashed back to the night before my medical school interview. I thought about the bitter, caustic smell of industrial bleach filling my old bedroom. I thought about how my parents had stood with their arms crossed, telling me to stop making a scene over a ruined jacket. They had tried to strip away my dignity, convinced that if they made me feel worthless enough, I would simply surrender my future. They wanted me to believe that blood was an unbreakable chain, an obligation that required me to endure their abuse in silence. But sitting here now, surrounded by authentic love and mutual respect, I finally understood the greatest lesson of my life. Walking away from a toxic family is not a tragedy. It is not a loss to be mourned. It is an act of profound self-salvation. You do not owe your peace of mind to the people who actively try to destroy it, even if you share the same last name. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. The gentle clinking of a spoon against a glass drew my attention back to the present. Dr. Sterling stepped out from the kitchen, a warm, proud smile on his face. He had been a steadfast mentor to me over the past year, guiding me not just through the complexities of managing the hospital trust, but through the rigorous demands of my medical training. The room quieted down immediately as he walked over to the center of the living room. He was holding a sleek, dark garment bag over his arm. "Imani," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, commanding warmth. "You have navigated trials that would have broken most people. You reclaimed your grandmother's legacy. You established a groundbreaking scholarship, and you have proven yourself to be one of the sharpest medical minds in this entire institution. But tonight is about your next step." He unzipped the garment bag and pulled out a crisp, pristine white coat. The room erupted into cheers and applause from my classmates. I stood up, my heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it took my breath away. I walked over to him and he held the coat open, helping me slip my arms into the sleeves. The fabric felt heavy, significant, and absolutely perfect. I looked down at the breast pocket. Stitched in beautiful, flawless navy blue embroidery were three words that completely erased the pain of my past. Dr. Imani Caldwell. The weight of the white coat settling onto my shoulders felt like the culmination of 1,000 silent prayers. As my friends and colleagues erupted into a fresh wave of applause, I looked down at the navy blue embroidery over my heart. Dr. Imani Caldwell. The letters were crisp, undeniable, and entirely mine. I ran my fingers over the meticulous stitching, letting the reality of the moment sink deep into my bones. For so long, my family had tried to convince me that I was nothing more than a burden, a broken shadow meant to be cast aside and forgotten. But standing in my own penthouse, surrounded by people who celebrated my intellect and my spirit, rather than my compliance, the shadows completely dissolved. Dr. Sterling stepped back, his eyes shining with a quiet, profound pride. He raised his glass of sparkling apple cider, and the rest of the room immediately followed suit. To Beatrice, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the soft rhythm of the neo-soul music playing in the background, and to the brilliant young woman who ensured her light will never be extinguished. To Beatrice, my friends echoed in perfect unison. I raised my own crystal glass, taking a slow, steadying breath. The toast was not just a tribute to my grandmother. It was a definitive declaration of victory. The multi-million-dollar medical trust that had once been treated as a personal slush fund by greedy, arrogant thieves was now doing exactly what it was meant to do. In the months that followed that explosive dinner party, the Beatrice Caldwell Memorial Scholarship funded the entire medical education of 12 extraordinary Black women. 12 brilliant women who would never have to choose between paying their rent and buying their medical equipment. 12 women who would go on to save thousands of lives in marginalized communities. That was real power. That was true untouchable legacy. As the evening gracefully wound down and the last of my guests hugged me goodbye, I found myself standing alone in the center of my expansive living room. The catering staff had quietly cleared the dishes, leaving the sleek modern space immaculate. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my palm flat against the cool, thick glass. If a camera were to slowly pull back right now, drifting out through the glass and floating high above the city streets, it would capture a woman standing at the absolute pinnacle of her life. Below me, the sprawling metropolis of Atlanta glittered like a sea of diamonds scattered across black velvet. The headlights of cars moved in steady, glowing streams along the interstate highways. The skyscrapers reached up into the night sky, bold and unyielding. The view was breathtaking, but what truly mattered was the profound, unshakable silence within my own mind. There were no more screaming matches echoing down the hallways. There were no more manipulative guilt trips designed to make me feel small. There were no more frantic attempts to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I had completely severed the rotting branches of my family tree, and in doing so, I had finally given myself the space to bloom. My parents were currently living out their days in a cramped, miserable apartment, suffocating under the heavy, inescapable weight of their own ruined reputation. Chloe was bagging groceries for minimum wage, completely ignored by the high society friends she had sold her soul to impress. And Bradley was sitting in a federal prison cell, stripped of his custom suits, his stolen wealth, and his pathetic white savior complex. They had tried to bury me under the weight of their own failures. They had thrown dirt on my name and literally tried to lock me in a psychiatric cage. But they forgot that I was a seed. I turned away from the window and walked down the wide, well-lit hallway toward my master suite. I opened the frosted glass doors to my walk-in closet, a beautifully organized space that reflected the order and peace I had finally brought to my life. I bypassed the row of expensive tailored scrubs and brand-new designer suits. I reached for a thick, opaque garment bag hanging at the very back of the rack. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the vintage navy blue blazer. It was the exact same jacket I had worn to my medical school interview. The jacket Chloe had viciously doused in industrial bleach the night before, hoping to humiliate me into canceling my appointment. But it did not look the same anymore. I had not thrown it away. Instead, I had taken it to a master tailor who specialized in historical garment restoration. I had instructed them not to replace the damaged fabric, but to embrace it. Taking inspiration from the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold to highlight its history and resilience. The tailor had meticulously embroidered over the violent, jagged edges of the bleach stain. Thick, shimmering threads of pure gold wove through the burned orange wool, tracing the exact path of the chemical burn and transforming the ugly scar into a breathtaking, intricate pattern. The golden thread seamlessly connected to the exposed silk lining, highlighting and framing the custom medical crest of my grandmother. It was no longer a ruined piece of clothing. It was a masterpiece of survival. I slipped my bare arms into the sleeves of the blazer. The fabric settled comfortably against my frame, feeling like a suit of armor. Then I reached for my new white coat, the one bearing my official title, and slid it on right over the blazer. The bright, sterile white of the medical coat framed the dark navy wool and the glittering gold embroidery perfectly. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was unbreakable. The next morning, the corridors of the downtown hospital were bustling with the frantic, purposeful energy of saving lives. Nurses hurried past with electronic tablets. Attending physicians conferred in low, serious voices outside patient rooms. The harsh fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished linoleum floors, and the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors provided a steady, familiar heartbeat to the building. I walked right down the center of the main corridor. My posture was perfectly straight. My head was held high. The crisp white fabric of my coat flared slightly with each confident step I took. The gold embroidery on my blazer caught the overhead light flashing brilliantly from beneath my lapels. People turned to look as I passed. They did not look at me with pity or disgust like the other applicants had in that waiting room a year ago. They looked at me with profound, undeniable respect. The nurses smiled. The senior surgeons offered polite nods. They knew exactly who I was. I was not just a first-year medical student. I was the guardian of the hospital's most vital legacy, and the woman who had single-handedly rooted out the corruption threatening their institution. I reached the heavy double doors of the cardiovascular wing, placing both hands on the cool metal push bars. I paused for a fraction of a second, taking in the absolute magnitude of the moment. I thought about the people who shared my blood but not my spirit. I thought about the desperate, cruel lengths they went to in order to break me. They had tried to bleach away my existence. They had tried to steal my legacy, bankrupt my future, and crush my spirit under the heavy, toxic weight of their own greed. They wanted to wash me out, to leave me faded, invisible, and entirely forgotten. But they forgot one crucial thing. You cannot use bleach to erase something that was fundamentally born to shine. You cannot wash away a legacy that is stitched directly into your soul. Every lie they told, every theft they committed, and every cruel word they spat at me only served to burn away the fears holding me back. They gave me the exact tools I needed to expose their rot and reclaim the throne they had stolen. I pushed the heavy doors open, stepping fully into the bright, demanding light of my future. I am Dr. Imani Caldwell, and this is just the beginning.